One, two, one, two, one, two, one, two. Okay, the Rules Committee will come to order. Today, we will consider two bills. The first is H.R. 4040, the Advancing Telehealth Beyond Covid-19 Act of 2021, which would make permanent the popular Medicare and Medicaid telehealth services and flexibilities established during the pandemic. Telemedicine offers an easy alternative for people to talk to their doctors and to get the care that they need from the safety and comfort of their homes. This measure would remove barriers to critical health care by making telehealth accessible to everyone, including seniors and rural patients. The second, H.R. 263, the Big Cat Public Safety Act, to protect first responders and safeguard these wild animals. Finally, before I turn this over to Mr. Cole, I want to recognize a special guest who is here with us in the Rules Committee this afternoon. Elaine Ismail is here. Elaine is a proud first-generation American, originally from a small village in Lebanon, who worked hard to put her three daughters, Sahara, Mimi, and Laurie, through college. Laurie, as you all know, is a familiar face to all of us because she serves as a senior professional staffer and foreign policy advisor on the Rules Committee. Growing up in war-torn Lebanon, Elaine never imagined she'd get to witness her own daughter working here in the United States Congress, or that she would get to join Laurie in greeting President Obama in the Oval Office at the end of her time on his staff. So, Elaine, we welcome you to the Rules Committee. I don't want to embarrass Laurie too much, but just so you know, we are incredibly grateful to have her here on our team, and especially on weeks like this. Again, it's great to have you here. And if you don't like the testimony, you can feel free to testify. So with that, let me turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks that he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me associate myself with your welcome. It's wonderful to have you here, and you should be very proud of your daughter, as I'm sure you are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing covers two bills. The first item I'll discuss is H.R. 263, the Big Cat Public Safety Act, which would make it unlawful to possess or trade in any big cat species, including lions, tigers, leopards, snow leopards, jaguars, cougars, or any hybrid thereof. The bill is intended to address the long-standing and well-documented abuses that have occurred with privately held and exhibited big cats outside a federally licensed facility. Although I'm supportive of this bill, I understand that the Republicans on the Committee on Natural Resources, which has jurisdiction over the matter, have some concerns, particularly about superseding traditional state authority to regulate big cats within their boundaries. I look forward to discussing these concerns during our hearing today. Our second item is H.R. 4040, the Advancing Telehealth Beyond COVID-19 Act. This bill would extend several Medicare telehealth flexibilities that were initially linked to the COVID-19 pandemic until the end of 2024. This will allow more Medicare practitioner recipients to utilize telehealth services, which is invaluable in rural districts like the one I represent. I understand that bipartisan negotiations took place prior to this bill coming to the Rules Committee that were intended to get to a compromise on a permanent extension of these authorities. But although the committee was not able to reach a final bipartisan agreement, this measure will still go a long way toward helping rural Medicare recipients like the ones that I'm privileged to represent. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today as we discuss this important matter. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ranking Member Cole yields back. I thank him for his opening statement. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 4040, the Advancing Telehealth Beyond COVID-19 Act of 2022. Chairman Pallone and Representative Carter, we are delighted that you are here. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Chairman Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, for the opportunity to speak before you today in support of H.R. 4040, the Advancing Telehealth Beyond COVID-19 Act of 2022. Now, this bill continues the work of Congress to provide access to telehealth services to Medicare beneficiaries. In March 2020, when the pandemic was beginning to take hold in America, Congress acted to significantly expand access to telehealth for Medicare beneficiaries. This action allowed Medicare to waive its originating site and geographic requirements for telehealth services. Prior to the pandemic, these requirements limited coverage of telehealth services under Medicare only to people in rural areas and only when provided at certain healthcare sites, and this led to telehealth rarely being utilized in Medicare. However, in light of the actions by Congress, Medicare beneficiaries in all areas of the country can utilize telehealth services from their homes for the duration of the pandemic, meaning the duration of the public health emergency. And this flexibility and others implemented by Department of Health and Human Services has led to millions of Medicare beneficiaries gaining access to telehealth for the first time. For example, during the public health emergency, Medicare has also covered an expanded list of telehealth services, covered audio-only telehealth services, and allowed for more types of providers to bill for telehealth services. While it should never fully replace in-person care, in my opinion, telehealth has been shown to be a convenient and safe way for people to access many types of services when they can't or prefer not to see their provider in person. So that's why in March of this year, 2022, Congress reached a bipartisan agreement to extend many of the current telehealth flexibilities for approximately 5 months after the end of the public health emergency, which we're still in. So our bill would build on that bipartisan agreement by extending the same flexibilities, the same language, for the period after the public health emergency and ending in December of 2024. So in theory, if the emergency ended at some time soon, and the 5 months were at the end of the year, this would extend it for another 2 years. That's pretty much it. It's bipartisan, and I think very important for quality of health for Medicare beneficiaries. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carter.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to testify about this on the Advancing Telehealth Beyond COVID-19 Act. You know, you may have heard me say it before, but there are 2 Georgias. I mean, Georgia's a very advanced state, but there's Atlanta and everywhere else. And everywhere else includes South Georgia, and South Georgia is very rural. And we have a lot of areas in South Georgia that need telehealth and that have benefited from telehealth. I grew up in a small town, albeit near Savannah, a larger area, but at the same time, that small town has utilized telehealth just as well. And that's why it's so vitally important. And, you know, as you know, I'm a healthcare professional, a pharmacist, and serving in Congress, one of my top priorities since I've been a member of Congress has been to make sure that healthcare is accessible and available. And that's very important. And telehealth has made it available. If you'll remember, there was an article in the London Times, I believe, that said that telehealth has advanced more in 1 month than it had in the last 10 years. And it has. And it's become an integral part of healthcare. There's no question about that. And the pandemic has really only further convinced me of the importance and of the benefits of telehealth services for patients and for healthcare providers as well. And it's obviously important for the pandemic, but it's also important because in rural areas, and particularly in South Georgia, we have a lack of healthcare professionals. We have a lack of physicians, a lack of psychiatrists, of specialists. And this helps us. Telehealth helps us address that problem. So it does more than just address the problem during the pandemic. It helps us address a bigger problem as well. You know, just months before the pandemic, in fact, prior to the pandemic, Medicare beneficiaries had roughly 13,000 telehealth appointments per week. That increased just months into the public health emergency. That increased over 3,000%. 3,000%. That's what I said. It's grown more in 1 month than it had in the last 10 years. We've been talking about telehealth in the Energy and Commerce Committee for years, ever since I've been a member of the committee for the last 6 years. And we've been talking about that as the wave of the future, the wave of the future. Well, guess what? The wave of the future came immediately during the pandemic. And it was a great benefit. But it's, the challenging thing that I found here is that this is a missed opportunity because we could have done better with this. This is a good bill, yes, and it's necessary. But it didn't go through the committee process. I would submit to you, the Energy and Commerce is the most important committee in Congress. I'm a little biased in that. I get that. But at the same time, this is why we have the Health Subcommittee. This is why we have the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, our committee, to go through bills like this. But This has not gone through the committee process, and that's a shame. I think it was a missed opportunity. I had legislation. I introduced bipartisan legislation along with Congresswoman Lisa Rochester Blunt. And I would submit to you, and I'm sure the chairman would attest, that she and I have worked on more bipartisan legislation than just about anybody. We have worked together on numerous occasions. We introduced legislation that would have addressed this to make sure that seniors didn't lose access to telehealth, because it has become so very important. Now, again, yes, this is good. This bill is extremely important, but it was a missed opportunity in the sense that we could have made it even better if it had gone through the committee process. One of the examples I would give with that is that we have not even had CMS to testify before the committee, before the Energy and Commerce Committee this session. We could have addressed some of the concerns that we have here, such as waste, fraud, and abuse. And look, as good as telehealth is, there is the potential there for fraud, and we all understand that. So I'm here to testify in favor of the bill. We know what happened during the pandemic. The Trump administration waived some of the regulations, and we saw that telehealth became an integral part of healthcare. I'm optimistic about telehealth. I think it's going to give us the ability to improve the health and the wellness of America, making accessibility and affordability even better. But there are things that we need to check in this, and we need to be careful about it. And I would submit to you that while I support the bill, it's a shame. It's just a shame that we didn't take something as important as this, take it through the committee, and make sure that it had the best possible product. And with that, I'll yield back.
Yeah, so let me just say that, I've talked to doctors and patients alike up in Massachusetts about the importance of the flexibilities that were put into place during the pandemic, and they all believe that this should continue. They also, and I represent rural areas, I represent suburban areas, I represent urban areas, even for people who live in the city. If you're a senior citizen, who doesn't have easy access to transportation or who has trouble kind of getting to a doctor's appointment or getting to a hospital where your doctor might be is a monumental task. And not every appointment has to be, I need to see you in person. I can, sometimes it's just being able to see the person. So I think this should continue. I don't know, Mr. Pallone, would you want to add anything? Or?
Well, I would just, obviously, Mr. Carter's supporting the bill, so I might be best to just leave everything alone. But I would say that, just so you understand, the reason that we're just doing it for 2 years is because of the pay-for, right? In other words, we were able to come to agreement on a pay-for. It costs about $2.5, I don't know what the figure is here. It's like about $2.5 billion to pay for the extra 2 years, and we couldn't come to an agreement on, beyond that. So that's part of it. The other thing, too, is that we really want to spend some time, the way he's discussing, looking at this long-term. And there's a report that's coming out, I think, in sometime next year that's, studying the impacts, cost, quality of care, access, program integrity, and all that. And so, I don't disagree with him, but basically what we're doing here is just extending the program the way it is for another 2 years and trying to do that before the end of the year, because there's not that many legislative days available. And we'll continue to do oversight and try to come up with a funding source, to go beyond. But that's why it's limited to the 2 years.
Well, there's an old saying, you don't have to agree on everything to agree on something. And there's something we agree on, we ought to move forward, and it seems like you both agree on there's something. And I hope there's a strong bipartisan vote on the floor when this comes up. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to do something I almost never do. I want to completely associate myself with your remarks in an opening statement. That doesn't happen very often. But I agree very much with you in this case. Also want to remind my friend from Georgia, if the Appropriations Committee does not do something, government shuts down. So top that. All these committees are important, but the most important one is the one that keeps the lights on.
By the way, so are we. I was going to object when you said.
I'm sorry, did I touch the nerve? I didn't.
Okay.
Well, you're driving the chairman and me together here, though, so that's okay. That doesn't happen very often either. I do have one quick question for my friend from Georgia. So I want you to expand a little bit on some of your concerns. I know that many on both sides of the aisle, including both of our witnesses, been working on this issue of expanding telehealth for a long time, even before the pandemic. So in your opinion, do you think the legislation goes far enough?
Well, that's why I say I just feel like it was a missed opportunity, because I think we could have done better if we got, and why have we got committees if we're not going through the committee process? Let's just do away with the committees if we're not going to go through them and not utilize them. And we really need, we could have done so much better, and yes, you're correct, and I am supporting the bill, but at the same time, I just felt like we could have done a lot better. We had a good product in energy and commerce, that we had the opportunity to get CMS in to testify before us, to tell us how we could have avoided waste, fraud, and abuse. We could have looked at how we could entice and encourage the private insurance companies to get more involved. All of those things are why you have committees. I'm just frustrated because we didn't go through committee.
Well, it'd be my hope that you will have the time to do that and the time that we give you here today. But I know continuing what we do have, as you both agree, is pretty essential right now. So I appreciate the bipartisan cooperation on that and on the legislation before us, and hopefully soon there'll be additional legislation that ranks in this area. I trust both of you to make sure that happens. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, and I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the statement of administration policy in support of this bill, without objection. Mrs. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to take a moment to thank both of you for bringing this really important bill to our committee. And I would say, you know, no disrespect, but if your committee was more important than ours, why are you here before us? But
I've been asking myself ever since I got here.
Your committee is very important to the House.
And so is yours.
Thank you. You know, nothing in this bill, and I regret that it's only 2 years, but I would say, Mr. Carter, nothing in this bill stops you from working together in calling CMS and having some oversight. And I hope that in that oversight, you would also include tracking of savings that we know is happening as people have more options to visit and speak to their doctors. I think that we get ahead of complications and therefore save on hospital stays, calls to 911 and paramedics and all of that. So I hope that you will take that under consideration as you continue to move this legislation forward and call in CMS to have that badly needed oversight. You know, way back in 2000, when I was first elected to City Council, we had a joint powers agreement between 4 cities for mental health services because no one had enough mental health providers. So telehealth was a big part of that work. It worked for us back then, and I think you know, through COVID, expanding this program, it has been so critically important. For me, it's helped me a great deal. I can't tell you how many times I've had appointments with my doctor right from the payphone booth off the House floor. So thank you for expanding it and giving all of us that opportunity to continue to see our providers and continue to get ahead of our healthcare issues. And with that, I hope we do get bipartisan support, and I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Plone, I just have to ask you, was there a reason not to do at least a legislative hearing on this concept of telehealth? I mean, we've all known, not just through this Congress, but even the previous Congress, we've all known that it's functioning under a waiver, enormously popular with patients, providers, and that we were not going back to the status quo of what it was before the pandemic. So what's the holdup on doing a hearing and at least get CMS to come in and testify to us, maybe the CBO to talk to us about what the cost would be. We could have done that. We should have done that. I mean,
Well, we had a hearing on telehealth in general, but we didn't have a hearing just on this bill. The hearing, I think, was in March, was last year we had a hearing, and it was in this session, but it wasn't on this specific bill. I guess, look, I mean, I guess I'm repeating myself, but, you know, we did this extension essentially till the end of the year in March. This is the same language. You know, by the end of the year, there are many things where we just go to the floor and attach them to other bills. We call them extenders. In my view, this is very important. I mean, you know, we don't come back again until, I don't know, what, like the middle of September. There's not that many legislative days left. So, you know, I think the feeling was we had a bipartisan consensus with the pay for the $2.5 billion. And it just made sense to try to move this as quickly as possible so we could get the Senate to do it. And we're waiting for this report that comes out early next year that will go into a lot of the things, you know, that Mr. Carter mentioned. So it just seemed like, let's get this going. We have the pay for, and we'll continue to monitor it for the future. We'll still look at a permanent bill the way Mr. Carter is suggesting.
well, I think Mr. Carter is exactly right. I hope we do spend the required time on that. You know, it's uncomfortable to me for us to say, here is a provision that turned out to be extremely popular with patients and physicians. We're concerned about the cost, so we're not going to go forward with a permanent solution, which I think kind of slows things down. But on the other hand, I mean, this is what patients need, and they've told us, and physicians have told us. So you know, since we've never had the true type of hearing to ask the question of the agency, what does this truly cost? What are potential savings? What avenues have you explored? But just to tell people that they can't have it because the proper way to deliver your care may cost a little bit more and we don't want to do it properly, that's a terrible message for us to be sending to patients and doctors. Mr. Carter, let me just ask you, I see in the amendments that have been filed, there's one by Michelle Steele of California, Mr. Schneider of Illinois, that extends for 2 years the first dollar coverage of telehealth services for those with a high deductible health plan in combination with a health savings account. This has been the standard under the waiver, but it expires on December 31st. So that does seem like a good idea to continue that type of exception for high deductible health plans and people who have high deductible health plans and health savings accounts. Would you agree that amendment?
I would agree, and thank you for making that point because it is important. It is very important. And I want to thank you and Representative Torres as well for making the point about this is not just about money. This is better health care. This delivers better health care in our country. It delivers better health care in the sense of accessibility and availability. And that's so vitally important. And it's going to be even more important in the very near future and right now. As we come out of this, as we have been cooped up for the last couple of years, the mental health issues that are prevalent in our society have got to be addressed. And this will give us the opportunity to do that.
Well, and not only that, when this goes away, or if it were to go away, there would be a significant increase cost to patients, and that's got to be reflected somewhere. It's one of those things you pick up on right away. Patients are never shy about telling you that, hey, wait, this is great. You mean I can get this solved over the telephone or with a computer visit, and I don't have to hire a babysitter, I don't have to miss work, I don't have to pay your exorbitant parking in your parking garage. I mean, there is a lot of potential savings downstream of us fixing this problem permanently. So I agree with you, Mr. Carter. This is something we could have worked on in a more collaborative way, and perhaps we could have come up with a permanent solution. The good news is in Washington, there's never any permanent victory nor any permanent defeat, so we'll live to fight another day. I do want to, I brought this point up last week when we were having one of these bills that they brought to the Rules Committee first rather than going to our committee, which I agree with you is at least one of the premier committees in Congress. There are several. I'm fortunate enough to be on two of them. But since we're talking about big cats later on today, the Rules Committee is kind of like the apex predator of legislation. I mean, you don't come to us first, you come to us last. And really, our committee work in Energy and Commerce is extremely important. We don't have open rules on the floor of the House anymore, but every member on the committee has an opportunity to be heard. The chairman can either say yes or no, I'm not going to continue to work with you on what seems to be a good idea. And that, to miss out on that is to really miss out on a big part of the legislative process. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to get that off my chest, and I'll
Thank
yield
you.
back.
Mr. Perlmutter, let's see, Mr. Raskin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Pallone, thank you for your bringing this forward. Mr. Carter, I just want to concur with you about the problem of the paucity of mental health care in rural areas. I represent a lot of rural areas in Frederick County and Carroll County, Maryland, and it's a very serious problem. I mean, there's a general shortage of mental health practitioners across the country, and it's especially dramatic in rural counties, and it's a real problem. And so I hope that in addition to this, which will be, ameliorative and help in some ways, we need to look in much more sweeping ways at dealing with that problem, getting more people going into the profession, incentivizing people to go into it, and coordinating much better between mental health practitioners and primary healthcare providers. So it's not just like contracted out to some provider who basically runs defense against getting people the care that they need. So I've talked to a lot of people about that, and I hope your committee can take a serious look at it. And I don't know whether you have any legislative proposals in the works on that or ideas that you've been focused on. Thank you. Or Mr. Chairman, if you have any comments on that. Yeah.
Ago now that we did a bill that was bipartisan that passed the House, and we're trying to get the Senate to move on that and so many other things, which really does a lot along the lines of what you suggested.
Yeah. All right, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to both witnesses for coming in today. Always nice to hear from both of you. Mr. Carter, do you want to talk about some of the missed opportunities to work to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse with this, or I guess I should just say fraud and abuse with this?
Well, yes, and I'd just say, again, that's why the committee process is so important. So we could have had CMS testify before us so that we could prevent some of this. It's going to happen. None of us are naive enough to believe that waste, fraud, and abuse doesn't happen, even in the best programs, and I would submit this is one of the better programs. But it is going to happen, and that would have given us the opportunity to look at it and to figure out how we could have avoided some of that. I get it. I understand that 2 years is better than nothing, and the way that this works, of course, when you have a public health emergency, as all of you know, it's up to the Secretary of HHS. He said that he'd give us 60 days notice, and that's great. But we need, people need more than just a 60-day notice and that it's going to be ending. We need to be able to prepare for these type of things. So I just felt like, if we'd gone through the committee process, we had a good bill in Energy and Commerce that, as I alluded to earlier, Representative Rochester Blunt and I had worked on together, but we didn't get to it. Now we're running out of time. It is what it is.
Mr. Chairman, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I mean, again, I don't want to be repetitive, but in March, well, I don't know when exactly it is, but
It was March 2021.
Yeah, well, in the legislation, the extender in March tasked this is an extension of that, right? That tasked the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, MedPAC, and the HHS Office of the Inspector General to study the impacts on cost, quality of care, access, integrity, which is the abuse that Mr. Carter is mentioning. And they're supposed to report back to us in the spring of next year. So the idea would be that we'll review this and look into the fraud and abuse and some of these other things to see whether we want to make this permanent.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, and thank you, Chairman Malone and Pallone, I'm sorry, and Ranking Member Carter. You know, like others have
Did
said.
you hear that, Ranking Member Carter? She said Ranking Member Carter. I just want to make sure y'all.
Sorry. Yeah,
Pardon me?
There we go. As several people have said, my constituents have really benefited from the expanded access to telehealth throughout the pandemic for many of the reasons that Chairman McGovern said. Difficulty with transportation, especially seniors. So we do look forward to being able to extend these services and appreciate you bringing the bill forward. So thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to associate myself with the comments of the other members on the Republican side, but I do want to just kind of share that issue with, that Mr. Carter mentioned, and I didn't call you Ranking Member Carter, but Mr. Carter, about, you know, the missed opportunity that because many of my constituents have benefited from telehealth, and I think the agreement here is that we all support it and would like to see it being used wisely, and particularly in rural areas, as Mr. Carter had mentioned. And so I appreciate the bill, but I do think that had it gone through committee, we could have really put together a strong bill that would have addressed more issues, and we could have extended it longer than 2 years, because I think that that's an important thing, too, that we make sure that people understand, you know, when they're dealing with their health care, that it's not just a two-year thing that they may be able to partake in, but this is going to extend into the future. And so I just feel, while I support the bill, I do think we missed an opportunity, and I wish we would have taken the time to send it through committee and really done the work that we should be doing on this huge issue. So, and with that, unless Mr. Carter has anything else he'd like to add, I will yield back.
fine, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Except I did like the sound of that Ranking Member, and I just,
Well, you know, maybe soon we'll use that. Thank you.
Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Chairman Pallone and Representative Carter, in whatever capacity you're here in, for being here. I certainly concur with what my colleague just said about the importance of this. I don't see this as a missed opportunity. I really see this as a starting point, and there is so much more, I think, that we can and we do need to think about, particularly as I often think about this issue over the next, well, I guess I'm about 2/3 of the way through the baby boom generation. And so we have about 7 more years, and all the baby boomers in the United States will be Medicare eligible. And utilization for Medicare or for health insurance once you retire is relatively modest in the 60s, but we know statistically it goes up pretty dramatically when you get into your 80s, mid-80s. So we have probably, if you sort of look at it statistically, about 15 years, and we're going to have a pretty dramatic utilization rate among Medicare recipients. And one of the ways, and by the same token, if you look at sort of the demographics of where we are, we're going to have fewer people in the workforce as a ratio of those in Medicare than we've ever had since the inception of the program. So in my mind, it really calls on us to think deeply about what we will transform to if we're going to be able to afford and continue to expand on services for Medicare. And I think technology and innovation offers an enormous opportunity for us. Excuse me. So we have not only the ability to communicate with one another via telehealth measures that we're talking about today, but if you think about the expansion of the ways in which we do diagnostic work and other kinds of medical devices, I even think of when I'm exercising in the morning, I'm checking my heartbeat, I'm looking at a whole host of things. In time, with sensor technology and what we're able to know, I could envision a world where we're literally in real time uploading data at scale that we're going to be able to communicate information to primary care providers and specialists literally instantaneously. And if you think about it, there may come a time where your primary care provider calls you or texts you or emails you and says, I don't like some measurement or some indication, I want you to come in. I mean, think about if we really want to get to real wellness in the world and in the United States and really think about how to get upstream for illnesses, either to lessen the impact of chronic illness or really to get upstream to limit pretty dramatically acute illnesses, innovation and technology offers us the kinds of tools that just weren't available 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I like this but I think it is a starting point. I mean, I think there's so much more that we can do, and by necessity we'll have to do, both in terms of quality of care and in terms of affordability. So I support this. I've worked on a number of projects back home in Rochester, New York, around telehealth, in innovation, in practice transformation. We've done a number of things when I was in the state legislature in New York. So I see this as all good. I do think there's a lot of opportunities here in the future, and just appreciate both of you being here. Appreciate the good work, and I'll support the underlying rule or the rule in the underlying bill. And thank you both for being here. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. DeSagne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to associate myself with almost all the comments of all of my colleagues, Dr. Burgess and Mr. Chairman. Your overall cost, I'm not a believer in dynamic scoring, but at least we should consider all of these things. And as a reluctant consumer of healthcare products, and as one of 7 million Americans with an immunocompromised system during a pandemic, telehealth is just remarkable. And my providers, as Dr. Burgess said, my doctors have all asked me frequently, how do we do more of this? So, Mr. Carter, I've always enjoyed our relationship, the work we've done on cancer prevention and research, and I look forward to, as Mr. Morelli said, this being a sort of starting point in a further discussion I think we can all agree on, and would be quite transformative for Americans. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ross, Mr. Neguse. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony. Please leave with our stenographer or submit electronically anything you would like inserted in the record. You are now excused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, good. Saved by the bell.
We will now hear from any amendment witnesses on H.R. 4040 at the end of the we will hear from any amendment witnesses on H.R. 4040 at the end of the hearing portion of today's meeting. Okay, and now I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 263, the Big Cat Public Safety Act. Representative Case and Ranking Member Westerman. Let's see. I think, yeah, Ranking Member Westerman is on his way up. Okay. So Mr. Westerman should be here shortly, so why don't we begin with you, Mr. Case? And
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member, members of the committee for holding this hearing today. Today I bring before you from our Committee on Natural Resources our Bipartisan Big Cat Public Safety Act, H.R. 263, which is led by Representative Quigley of Illinois and co-sponsored by 258 of our colleagues, 206 Democrats and 52 Republicans, including members on this committee on both sides. This bill would, number one, end the private ownership and breeding of big cats as pets throughout our country, and number two, prohibit exhibitors from allowing public contact with big cats, including cubs. It's important to realize that this bill is not new to this committee or this Congress. In fact, it has been around in some incarnation for about a decade now. In the 112th Congress in March of 2022, Mr. McKeon of California introduced it on a bipartisan basis. It came back in the 113th Congress by Mr. McKeon on a bipartisan basis. In the 114th Congress, Mr. Jones of North Carolina took it over and introduced it on a bipartisan basis. In the 115th Congress, Mr. Denham of California on the Republican side took it over and introduced it on a bipartisan basis. Mr. Quigley introduced it in the 116th Congress, in which it was again introduced on a bipartisan basis and passed by suspension with 48 Republicans voting in favor. And it comes before us again today. By way of background, since 1990, we have seen somewhere around 300 dangerous incidents involving big cats in the United States, resulting in human injuries, mauling, and death. In many cases, these animals are shot and killed as first responders are simply not equipped for these situations. In our committee, we had compelling testimony from Sheriff Matt Lutz of Muskegon County, Ohio, who cited an incident in 2011 in which a private collector there released some 50 exotic animals into the public domain, causing great difficulty by first responders and certainly high risk, which was averted in that particular situation, but was certainly noted. Those severe threats to first responders and the public from big cats are why the National Sheriff's Association, the Fraternal Order of Police, and other first responders have endorsed the Big Cat Public Safety Act. There are somewhere around 20,000 big cats in private ownership throughout our country. The reason that I say somewhere around is because nobody really knows. There's no requirement of registration, of notification. There is no requirement of disclosure, and therefore first responders and the public simply don't know what may happen and what to prepare for. H.R. 263 corrects all of this. It protects first responders and the public, as well as, of course, the animals themselves, most of which are endangered species. It will, for the first time ever, provide law enforcement agencies with the information they need to know how many big cats are held in private ownership. This bill specifically grandfathers current ownership subject to required reporting of restrictions or live public contact display. It also exempts ownership for legitimate purposes such as zoos, conservation, volunteers engage in conservation of these beautiful animals, and so it is not an across-the-board prohibition. We may hear from some opposed to this bill that this is really a USDA issue, not a Fish and Wildlife Service issue. The fact is that the Fish and Wildlife Service has long been responsible for regulating big cat interstate transport and mistreatment under the Lacey Act to include endangered species. So while the USDA does provide basic requirements for preventing cruelty to exhibit animals, the Fish and Wildlife Service is the appropriate agency to provide stringent standards to ensure that threatened and endangered species are managed to actively promote conservation regardless of whether the animals are exhibited to the public. And the Big Cat Public Safety Act therefore merely strengthens and expands an already existing framework under the Lacey Act. This is a common sense solution whose time is due. It has been supported for 10 years plus. During that 10 plus years, the problem has not abated. The risk is probably greater than it was 10 years or even 2 years ago. And so this is an appropriate response by Congress to impose a national standard to correct for a patchwork of state standards that regulate the ownership, breeding, and display of big cats. And so I commend my colleague, Mr. Quigley, for his work along with our bipartisan co-sponsors. Urge this committee to bring this to the floor and yield back.
Thank you very much. I think maybe we'll just go to questions while we're waiting for Mr. Westerman. I have none. Mr. Dole?
No, I just want to thank the gentleman for bringing the suspend.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Mr. Westerman, you're up.
Great timing. Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Cole. Today's consideration of H.R. 263, the Big Cat Public Safety Act, follows action last month by the Committee on Natural Resources, where this bill passed on a party line vote after 2 lengthy days of markup. At a time when gas prices were setting record highs on a nearly daily basis, rather than address the energy crisis, the Natural Resources Committee was taking up this legislation. At that time, committee Republicans offered a number of amendments aimed at making the point that we should be focused on reducing energy and food prices, not exotic pet ownership. Rather than address the real crises of the day, Democrats shut down discussion on our amendments and forced a vote on final passage of this bill. The Biden administration recently trumpeted that gas prices have gone down, but they are still an unbearable $4.50 a gallon. We can do better than this, but unfortunately, we have missed that opportunity once again today. The bill before us today is aimed at regulating the private ownership of so-called big cats by creating a new and duplicative regulatory authority at the Department of Interior. Contrary to some assertions that this bill merely fixes a drafting error in current federal law, the legislation is actually a considerable expansion of federal regulation under the Lacey Act. In 2003, Congress enacted the Captive Wildlife Safety Act to make it illegal to import, export, buy, sell, transport, receive, or acquire certain live big cats across state lines or the U.S. border. In 2003, the 2003 law charged USDA's Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, with promulgating necessary regulations and specifically stated that nothing in the act supersedes state laws. This bill would expand existing law by blatantly overriding state law and requiring big cats exhibited at USDA licensed or USDA registered facilities be at least 15 feet from the public or behind a permanent barrier. It would mandate all persons or entities that currently possess big cats to register each animal with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service within 180 days of enactment as a requirement of keeping their animals. In addition, it would require big cat owners to certify that they will not breed, acquire, or sell any big cats, and would prohibit direct public contact. All of these mandates would supersede state authority and duplicate existing federal government processes. There actually is a simple fix. The U.S. Department of Agriculture already regulates the treatment of big cats in research and exhibition pursuant to the Animal Welfare Act of 1966. The USDA already has inspectors and law enforcement officers in place that are experts in animal welfare issues. But this bill ignores the existing regulatory framework and would create a new regulatory system. My staff and I have spent considerable time on this issue since the beginning of this Congress. One of our first questions was why not just work with the House and Senate Agriculture Committees under the jurisdiction of the Animal Welfare Act? The response we received was an admission that the bill's outside proponents would rather work through the Committee on Natural Resources rather than the Committee on Agriculture. This is a classic case of congressional venue shopping. Creating two regulatory frameworks at two different departments, the Department of Interior and USDA, overlaid with existing state regulation will only create confusion and duplication. For that reason, I offered an amendment at our markup that would have moved the authorities proposed by H.R. 263 into the current USDA framework without superseding state authorities. That alternative was unfortunately rejected on a party line vote. I have filed that amendment with this committee and asked that it be made in order under the rule. While I understand and agree that we want to reduce dangerous encounters between the public and big cats, I cannot support this bill because it is an overreaching, duplicative, and precedent-setting proposal that has already served as a blueprint for pending legislation on other species. We need to work within existing authorities, not create new and duplicative ones. More importantly, we need to focus on the crises facing Americans, including staggering inflation and the high price of energy, not big cats. Thank you, and I yield back.
Terrific. Thank you both for your testimony. I want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement of administration policy in support of this bill. I support the bill. I have no questions. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. I just want to welcome both our witnesses on your back.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks. I think I've been one of the co-sponsors on this bill for a dozen years, so I support it. It's good to see Mr. Westerman here. I think it's been since Friday that we saw you in Rolls, and Mr. Case, good to see you. I yield back.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just agree with Ranking Member Westerman. I think we probably could have found wiser activities to be involved with than this legislation. Yes, Bruce?
Yeah, I would just to say, you know, there's nothing wrong with fixing the big cat bill, but there are more pressing issues across the country. And this just makes it a duplicative mess when we've got a simple tweak we can make under APHIS and through USDA that would totally take care of this without trampling on existing state laws and existing laws that are on the books. So, you know, again, instead of focusing on those issues that my friend Mr. Burgess is talking about, we're just muddying the water with a cat bill that's gone wild.
Let me just ask you, are current owners, are they allowed to phase in, or does it happen all at once? What's going to happen to the big cat owner after this bill is signed into law that the president likes so much?
Well, that's a good question, and then you're going to have another agency that doesn't have the law enforcement you're going to be dealing with U.S. Fish and Wildlife instead of APHIS. And nothing against U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but I think they're going to have a huge learning curve on how to even enforce this law and going out and hiring people to enforce it. And it's going to create a lot of confusion that could simply be avoided if we just fix the law by changing some of the code and what APHIS deals with.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
I think Mr. Case was looking to be recognized, if you want to.
Yes, please.
May I? Well, first of all, they clearly grandfathers big cat, current big cat ownership, so there's no phase-in. The phase-in is that the cats pass on, subject to regulation, disclosure, which I think is appropriate. We should know where these big cats are from a law enforcement perspective. On some of Mr. Westerman's other points, I spoke earlier before he got here, so I would just leave those comments with you. It's entirely appropriate for Fish and Wildlife Service to regulate in this space. It regulates under the Lacey Act. It regulates endangered species. There is no regulation at present in the space that we are talking about right now. And so this is a straight policy call as to which agency is better suited to the purpose of the bill. This bill proposes and believes that Fish and Wildlife is the appropriate agency.
I'll reclaim my time and yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin.
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank both members for coming in and testifying. Mr. Westerman, you were talking about some of the amendments Republicans had during the markup. Would you like to expand upon any of those?
Yeah, it basically just took Fish and Wildlife out of the equation, left the jurisdiction with APHIS and the Animal Welfare Act, where they are totally capable, actually more capable of enforcing the law and addressing the real problem, other than creating a whole new authority under a new agency dealing with the Lacey Act, which has to do with transporting animals into the country. This is getting into intrastate activities that, again, APHIS is very well suited to handle this. It's for the life of me, I can't figure out why we don't just fix it in the existing or under the existing authority with APHIS rather than just mushrooming this the bureaucracy by getting Fish and Wildlife involved in something that, quite frankly, I don't think they want to be involved in.
Gaze, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I've already stated my position. I mean, this is a judgment that Fish and Wildlife is entirely appropriate. It is within Fish and Wildlife's wheelhouse. The administration supports this bill, supports Fish and Wildlife assuming this jurisdiction. It does regulate under the Lacey Act. It does regulate endangered species. And the position that Mr. Westerman has taken, as he has advocated in his proposed amendment, would not allow the Lacey Act to preempt state law at all. That is a complete overreach. We still need the Lacey Act, and we still need this regulation. Let's focus back on the purposes of this act. Somewhere in the range of 20,000 big cats out there. We don't know who has them, where they are, when they might be released. This is a law enforcement issue. Law enforcement wants this bill because they feel at risk. They're not trained to handle these emergencies before you even get to the public concerns, the public health at risk concerns, as well as the animals themselves.
Thanks, Mr. Case. I appreciate it. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
I don't have any questions. Thank you for bringing the bill.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I just, following up a little bit on what Mr. Reschenthaler was asking about, from what you indicated, Mr. Westerman, in your testimony, there are already 2 federal laws on the books and numerous state laws that already regulate big cats. And how would the authorities proposed in this bill match up with those existing laws and rules?
Well, again, they would override state authority. It would put this under the jurisdiction of U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Lacey Act, which I think is opening up Pandora's box. This is a move that's being pushed by animal rights activists. There's already been other bills already filed that would take advantage of this situation. For example, Mr. Blumenauer of Oregon has introduced H.R. 3135 to regulate the private ownership of monkeys. Even Fish and Wildlife opposes this. Ms. DeLauro of Connecticut has introduced a bill using the Lacey Act to virtually eliminate mink farming. And this is just the camel getting his nose under the tent to use the Lacey Act to regulate things that APHIS is already in charge of taking care of. And again, I have no problem with making the regulations stronger under APHIS, but I do have a big problem with pushing this into the Lacey Act when it's not really about addressing the issue with the cats. And I have a big cat recovery facility in Arkansas that takes these from around the country when people dump these cats when they're too big to pet. And I would really like to see this solved, but there's a simple, easy fix to solve it without expanding the Lacey Act to an area where I don't believe it was ever meant to be used.
And Mr. Westerman, was that easier fix part of your substitute that you offered? Because I understand you had a substitute.
Yeah, that was the substitute I offered, and it's the amendment I've got before the Rules Committee today to it. You know, at least let's put this amendment out there and let the body of the full House look at it and see that there is an easier fix than opening up Pandora's box with the Lacey Act.
Thank you, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Morelli, Mr. DeSagne, Ms. Ross, Mr. DeSagne, do you have any questions?
Nope, yield back.
Thank you, okay, all right, Mr. Goose, okay. Anybody else on the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I'd like to thank our witnesses for your testimony. Please leave with our stenographer or submit electronically anything you would like inserted in the record, and you are free to go. Thank you. Are there any other members who wish to testify in H.R. 263? Seeing none, that closes the hearing on H.R. 263. Are there any members who wish to testify on H.R. 4040? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on H.R. 4040. At this time, the chair will be in receipt of a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I move the committee grant H.R. 263, the Big Cat Public Safety Act, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources, now printed in the bill, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill, as amended, shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes an order the further amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, if offered by the member designated in the report, which shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 4040, the Advancing Telehealth Beyond COVID-19 Act of 2022, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-59, modified by the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit, and finally, the rule provides that House Resolution 517 is hereby adopted.
You heard the motion of the gentleman. Any discussion or amendment? Did you have any discussion or amendment? It's a simple anti-slavery resolution. Yeah. It should be in your inbox. I don't think there's any. I think it's Slavery Remembrance Day. You want to? Any motions? Any amendments? Hearing none, the vote is on the motion from the gentleman from Colorado. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter.
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin. Aye. Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli. Aye. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross. Aye. Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess. No. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mr. Rushenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
8 yeas, 4 nays.
And the motion is agreed to, and Mrs. Torres will carry it for the Democrats. And without objection, I ask unanimous consent that the statement by Representative Doggett be part of the record as well. Without objection, that's it. We're done for today. The Rules Committee is adjourned.